importance of a seeking mind. And if you read a book which opens up a bit of your mind that hasn't been opened up before, then that's good for you, even though it may not be actually true. The very fact that your mind is opened a bit is the important thing. Then maybe, you read other people's books. I mean, I could say that about myself, because I've always laughed at this nonsense about space. But then I went to see Close Encounter of a Third Kind, and it completely changed my view, because I thought that was a very meaningful approach to it. I don't believe that Close Encounter of a Third Kind has ever happened, or may ever happen in that exact way. But it was a very interesting view. After all, in Buddhism, people are only saying, or the Buddhas were only saying, that through cause and effect, it could be possible, or it is possible, actually Buddhism said, that there are other worlds where people live. We can't prove it. It's up to us whether we believe it or not. But in terms of cause and effect, I definitely can see that it's possible. Isn't it? If all the circumstances are similar. That's the point. So I don't think we should condemn anything in a way. We must make our final decision. But in a way, you can't write off anything in terms of the unknown, which this comes into the category of. As long as it's unknown, then we should have open enough, broad enough minds to keep our minds open on the subject and read, or hear everything about it and take it into us and keep that seeking mind an open thing. Do you agree? Good. Okay, the limitations of scientific research we're on to now. So Sensei points out that science is coming near to an understanding of the existence of Ku. And the branch of science, of course, where this is most obvious is in physics. The physicists have reached a point in the development of their research and their thinking where they can't, in a sense, go on any further in terms of the classic way of proving things scientifically. They've reached that sort of borderline where they're going to have to dip over into, or it looks like they may have to, and indeed some scientists are going over the border into the world of religion and philosophy. This is really interesting. And I think what's made this most necessary, or what has precipitated this, is the fact that more and more scientists have become aware that something is connecting everything with everything else, that there is a link between all phenomena. So what is that link? That's what they can't get at any further. So I think I told you earlier in one of the earlier sessions about Dr. Yamazaki and I visiting a scientist called David Bohm in London, a physicist in London University. He's quite famous and he's quite revolutionary in a lot of the things that he talks about. And he said to us that he fully understands that there is a mechanical energy, which is the energy which makes our arms and legs move, and our eyes and move and so on and so forth, and that there must be a universal energy. And since that universal energy exists in the entire universe, that energy must also exist in human beings. So the question that the point which is reached is, how do you tap it? How do you prove it scientifically, and how do you tap it? And that was the point he'd reached. I'm sorry, this was 10 years ago. I'm sure he's still there at the same point. So Dr. Yamazaki said to him, well, we can, help you in that respect. if you like to try chanting Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. But he was absolutely silent. He wouldn't answer. He knew Dr. Yamazaki was sincere, but he wouldn't answer. And I understand why. He is a scientist. He's a physicist. He's got to prove things by physics. He's saying to himself, how can I work out, using all these complicated calculus and algebraic formulas, how can I get at it this way? That's what he's saying. We say, just chant Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. But that's not enough. So science, some physicists are much more going over the border. The man Capra, K-A-P-R-A, who's written 2 or 3 books, he's well into the philosophical side of things now. And this is the difference, isn't it, between 2 approaches of philosophical thinking, basically. One being the analytical way, which is what science uses, and the other in what's called the inductive way, where you take the whole thing, the whole concept or the whole reality of some aspect of life, and then you work outwards from there, rather than analyzing the validity of this from the outside towards the center point. You go to the center point first and then go backwards. I think, of course that has always been done in science to some extent, because they've often started their research based on a hypothesis. But on the other hand, that hypothesis was usually fairly limited. In the inductive way of thinking, you've got to take really the whole of something. We shall come back to this again in a moment, in order to work your way outwards from that. So if you look at those of you who've got your books, the next bit, Robert can help us over, 271, page 271, and read what Sensei and TOYNBEE say about this particular fact.
First of all, the last paragraph of Sensei's speech, or Sensei's section. All of these varying approaches to research on the ultimate nature of matter seem to me to be leading directly to the Buddhist concept of void, ku. The Buddhist void transcends being and non-being because all things are essentially void. The void includes but is not time and space. Since modern physicists cannot come closer to the ultimate nature of matter than 2 unreconcilable pictures, subatomic particles and waves, it may be that they will be forced to admit that matter is actually neither of these 2, and that perhaps that it is a non-thing. Should they admit this, they would be approaching the Buddhist belief that matter and all things consist of void. TOYNBEE. My understanding of modern physics is so rudimentary that I cannot express any authoritative opinion about current tendencies in this field. Subject to this reservation, I do think that modern physics may be approaching the limits of what is understandable in terms of time and space. I therefore guess that physics may never begin to give us an understanding of the non-physical, that is spiritual, aspect of reality. Time and space are functions of the physical aspect of reality. But reality is spiritual as well as physical, and its spiritual aspect is just as real as its physical aspect. The Buddhist concept of void refers to the spiritual aspect of reality, and I believe that spiritual life can be described only in spiritual terms, though our vocabulary for spiritual things is derived by analogy from our vocabulary for physical things, because the human mind finds it relatively easy to grasp physical phenomena, whereas spiritual things are impalpable and elusive. While we cannot avoid using an analogical vocabulary for speaking about spiritual things, this vocabulary is not only inadequate, it can be positively misleading. It betrays us into misconstruing the nature of spiritual reality by thinking of it in the inappropriate physical terms that our vocabulary suggests.
So getting at the ultimate reality, is a very difficult thing, isn't it, to explain in our language. Because what you're talking about is something that one can't see or measure in terms of time or space at all. The ultimate reality exists eternally. That's what Buddhism is saying. But the ultimate reality is definitely there, because out of that ultimate reality we see such an amazing collection of different manifestations of life which have arisen from that ultimate reality, the ultimate reality of life. So it's not an easy thing to explain. You know, what is it, this entity of life, which can produce its physical manifestations in so many billions and billions and trillions of different ways and forms? It is an extraordinary thing, and which has that inbuilt ability to always renew itself. The very ground of being, as we said some philosophers call it. So it is a difficult thing to grasp. And what's more, you know, each entity has its distinct nature and character because of that nature. So although it may appear in different forms in case of human beings, nevertheless, always, you know, when you or I are reborn, though we may look different, though we may have a different name, though we may be born in a different place, but nevertheless it's always the nature of oneself. That's what Buddhism is saying, because that is it arises from the entity of our specific life. And of course, when you link that to the purpose in life, which matches exactly, Buddhism says, that unique entity or self, also that makes even more sense. I mean, Nichiren Daishonin described it in the simplest way in saying, you know, that cherries, pears, peaches, plums, I think damsons is the correct translation, are all supreme in themselves. And, you know, cherries don't, you know, renew themselves as apples. They all have the innate nature of a cherry. And just the same as we have our innate natures. But this is a mystical thing, isn't it? Because this entity which manifests itself physically is unseen. We can't see it, we can't measure it, we can't describe it very easy in ordinary words. But nevertheless, it must exist. Because otherwise, where do all these physical manifestations of life come from? And we go back to the lizard's tail again, don't we? The fact that the lizard can produce its tail again, and the tail is perfect for that lizard. It's not even his next-door neighbor's tail. It's his tail. And then, as you know, probably you've seen these photographs taken by the Russians of life force at work. And this is all a matter of life force. That's another way of calling this incredible energy. For instance, there is a photograph of a leaf, and then the leaf is cut in half, and still through this special camera which can photograph life force, you can see the clear, perfect outline of the half of the leaf which has been taken away. In other words, the life force or the energy of that leaf is still there, vibrating, for some time after it's been cut in half. So there is a whole leaf, but one half of it is just that bit less distinct than when it was an actual physical whole. They're so fascinating, isn't it? And I mean, these same photographs, you can see life force like sparks coming out of the end of a photograph of someone's hand, the end of the fingers. Then some people talk about being able to see people's auras. What is an aura? An aura is that aura of life force that is around each one of us. With some it's stronger than others, depending obviously on how much life force you've got. If you're in hell, your life force is very little. But if you're in Buddhahood, it's colossal. So it's a mystery, isn't it? The mystery of life. And it's sort of encapsulated in this whole thing of the ultimate reality of life. That at the heart of everything there is the ultimate reality, which Buddhism describes as Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, or Chutai. That vital third truth of the three truths, which binds together the physical and the spiritual in absolute harmony and creates life, or a manifestation of life, a phenomenon of life. So in talking about that, they get involved in both Hinayana, or Southern Buddhism, as Toynbee calls it, and Mahayana, Northern Buddhism. And Sensei points out that in the West, the understanding or knowledge of Mahayana Buddhism is very, very, very little. On the other hand, our knowledge in this country of Hinayana Buddhism is very, very great, because that was where our empire existed and embraced a whole number of Hinayana Buddhist countries. So we've got masses and masses of books on that, but we haven't got masses and masses of books, believe it or not, on Mahayana Buddhism. That's the one we're concerned about, because Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism, of course, is Mahayana. So that is the importance of the Institute of Oriental Philosophy, which Sensei is going to set up. First step will be in the library of Taplow Court. And that's very, very important, because through that we can begin to interest scholars in carrying out research in Mahayana Buddhism. And it's going to lead to some very fascinating situations. In a way, it'll lead to quite a revolution in academic thinking, because at the moment no scholar really understands Mahayana Buddhism. And the only works on Mahayana Buddhism are mostly by Americans in the early 50s, and at that time the Soka Gakkai wasn't understood at all. And in truth, the Soka Gakkai would have found it difficult to explain themselves. They hadn't even got a Gosho in those days. I think it was 1955 that the Gosho was first produced in a way which could be available to anyone. It was very early days. So this institute, yes. Was it? Thank you very much. Okay. Thanks, Brian. 52. So anyway, study, in other words, was in its infancy at that time. And the only person who was able to help at all was Mr. Toda, who of course had learnt a great deal from Mr. Makiguchi, and he used to hold these study meetings, often at the head temple. So whatever happens, this institute, we've got to correct the academic view of Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism. That is the ultimate, because that academic view is sketchy, to say the least. And the facts are often distorted through following reports of those early days of the Gakkai, when they were in no position to be able to really explain in detail. So still, the accounts, for example, of Nichiren Daishonin's life are erroneous, to say the least. And this is a very sad thing. If you go to the British Museum, if you go to any library, what you'll find is books written by people who just did not have access to anything to help them to understand or study or research what Nichiren Daishonin's life was really like. And of course in those days too, the number of people who could speak or read Japanese was very few. Fortunately, that's getting much greater now. Many more people studying Japanese than there were 30, 40 years ago. So anyway, this is an exciting development, this Institute of Oriental Philosophy. And we've also, Sensei in 1973, as you know, started a book collection. It's known as the IKEDA collection at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And he was going to give a further big donation of books to that collection during his visit this year. Anyway, he decided the book should come anyway, even though he had to cancel his trip. And they arrived, in fact, at Tableau Court last Friday. So there's another great, I think, how many tons of books were there? You remember? You had to carry a lot of them. Something like 2 tons, I think. Incredible. Yeah, books are very heavy things anyway. But anyway, that again, of course, was very important, that in that library in Oxford there should be a really comprehensive books on Oriental philosophy, and particularly Mahayana Buddhism. So these are all important developments for the future. We've got to get the academics have got to get their facts right. Once they've got their facts right, that will then spread from Oxford and Cambridge and all the other universities to many parts of the world and rectify things. And then they move on from there to talk about the unification of religions. And really, Sensei is saying this is a very difficult thing. And of course it is difficult because in terms of Mahayana Buddhism, or in terms of Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism, the established religions in the West, and for that matter in the East as well, are only partial truths. They're based on partial enlightenment. We've already talked about Christianity. Christian view is partial. So the Christian view is too that the Holy Spirit only enters into you through God's grace. So it immediately presupposes that there is some exclusive exclusivity. If a person is considered to be filled with the Holy Spirit, he's a very exclusive person. And exclusivity, of course, leads to authoritarianism, doesn't it? There is an exclusive person through whom you can receive the sacraments in Mass or Holy Communion or whatever church you belong to. So that human being is on a pedestal higher than those who receive the sacraments. And of course that leads in turn to things like the infallibility of the Pope and all those arguments that have been going on. So Buddhism, on the other hand, expresses a universal view, not an exclusive view. Buddhism says that Buddhahood exists in everybody. There isn't a single person that hasn't Buddhahood within them. And it's in everyone and everything. So this is, a totality that Buddhism is concerned with on a universal scale and not on an exclusive scale. So again, there are tremendous differences between Buddhism and other religions. So very difficult to combine all religions in that way. The only way is that the great religion can embrace all those other religions which have partial truths or partial enlightenment and lead people on to see the whole truth, isn't it? So, and that was really my experience, because I felt, having tried my best at Christianity over a number of years, that what Buddhism did for me, as I've said before, was to explain what God actually is, really. So, Robert, maybe you could read, where have we got to? Page
275.
275.
273. 273C. Mahayana. I haven't read that yet.
No, go on to 275.
Right. So page 275, the one section marked IKEDA. I too am of the opinion that because ultimate reality is vast and profound, and because our ability to understand it is shallow and limited, we can grasp only partial meanings of aspects of the whole. Even though we are able to understand only aspects of the ultimate reality, there are cases in which potentialities exist for all people to put religious teachings into actual practice, and other cases in which such practical application is limited to a small number of people. I believe that the Buddhist understanding can be put into application by all peoples, whereas the teachings of Judaism and Christianity are limited. This difference gives rise to another of a more profound nature. If God is a volitional being like man, then only those people in God's grace can come into contact with him and receive his revelations. Under these circumstances, human volition cannot be very important. Buddhism, on the other hand, teaches that the ultimate reality exists throughout the universe and to an equal extent in all living things. Consequently, all human beings enjoy equal possibilities of coming into contact with that reality. Even granted that between the two kinds of religions, recognition of the ultimate reality, basic attitudes and ideals about human life and actions arising from these attitudes may share common points, the practical methods used for the sake of an understanding of the ultimate reality differ. Furthermore, the way we understand ultimate reality inevitably reflects deeply on the practical aspects of daily living.
Okay, everyone, so far? So then Sensei really delves into the whole Buddhist approach to life. And what he says is that to grasp the true aspect of things, there are two very important approaches that have to be borne in mind. One is that it isn't enough to analyze. We talked about that a little earlier. But you must also synthesize, that is to say, view the whole as well as the parts of the whole. And secondly, the realization that nothing in this universe is fixed or static. Everything is constantly moving, flowing, changing, wherever you look. Nothing is fixed at all, except the Gonzen. So in terms of analysis and synthesis, I think you all understand now the importance, the problem of specialization in that it doesn't look at the totality of things and looks only at the specific parts, rather like the story of the blind man and the elephant. You know, he could feel something and guess that that was an ear because it was something like his own ear, even though it was very big, but he couldn't take in the elephant as a whole. So the same thing, we have to take in the whole in order to understand the function of the part. And as regards nothing being fixed or static, of course, this is of incredible importance. And we have to face the fact that as human beings, we find it very difficult to reconcile ourselves to the fact that everything is changing. We want everything to be static, don't we? Yet nothing can be. We think our lives are secure at this moment, say, but they could be insecure tomorrow morning, financially or in terms of relationships, anything. Everything is always changing. But human beings don't like change. Even if you try to change some small aspect of organization in NSUK, you get always the inevitable human reaction. No one wants it at the beginning. We want everything to be the same, and everything jolly well won't be the same. Even in the next hour, it will not be the same as now. That's the truth about life. And that is what Buddhism is teaching. And interestingly enough, just only yesterday we studied last night at the Central Committee some guidance from Sensei, new guidance, in which he talked about the fact that life is constantly changing, nothing is static, and the importance of realizing that. And interestingly enough, he said that in this guidance, that people, and he was talking to Japanese people in Okinawa, can often be obsessed with the fact that everything changing, quite opposite to us. In the Orient, it seems, people can be obsessed by that fact that nothing is the same today or tomorrow. And therefore, they have a sort of apathy, I guess, as a result of that. There's nothing they can do about it. So all they can do is to get on and live from day to day, because everything's changing. Whereas our view in the West, as so often is the case, is completely, I believe, the opposite. We're always desiring everything to be static and refusing to recognize that it'll change. But either way, of course, the important thing is that what doesn't change is the Gohonzon, or the law of life. And that if you anchor your life to the law of life, to the rhythm of life, or the energy of life, then you'll ride through all those changes and get through, as the Gosha says, to the other shore. That's the point, isn't it? That's the marvelous thing about this Buddhism. Really incredible that one can ride through all these changes. So you live for 20 or 30 years, I've lived for getting on to 70 years. Whatever happens, you must have seen incredible changes, even in yours. In my lifetime, I've seen unbelievable changes. Not just changes in customs and trends, but changes that affect my life incredibly. And of course, if you're not latched on to that incredible power of life which will send you forward if you're in harmony with it, you do get swept this way and that by these changes, and hit in the face and in the backside, and you're constantly being pushed this way and that. But with Nam-myoho-renge, you just go on, don't you? You can go on riding through all those colossal waves sometimes and get there. That's the thing. So Sensei in this guidance says, we must hold on to our determinations and goals. Even though things are changing today and tomorrow, we mustn't lose sight of our goals. And of course, with the power of Nam-myoho-renge, we can still get there. But many other people, because of these changes, because they're unprepared for those changes, are so thrown, by things that happen, that they do lose their goals. Many people give up and lead humdrum, disappointed, unhappy lives as a result. So we're unbelievably fortunate in that respect. And then finally, Sensei explains Ichinen Sanzen. You've got another diagram there. But just very quickly, in a few minutes before we close, as usual, Buddhism, in its explanation of life, does find the middle way. It does analyze, but at the same time, it synthesizes. It looks at the totality. So even if you look at this explanation here of Ichinen Sanzen, you have the 10 basic states of life or worlds. That is analysis, isn't it? Analyzing what its basic states are. But then, if you look to the right, there is a heading there, mutual possession of the 10 worlds. The mutual possession of the 10 worlds immediately translates the analysis into totality. In other words, it is then, through the mutual possession of the 10 worlds, one realizes that even in the state of Buddhahood, hell can exist, as the Gosho said. And in hell, a state of Buddhahood can exist. Therefore, a Buddha is a human being, and Buddhahood, exists in every human being. So that is the totality, isn't it? Which arises from understanding the 10 basic states of life. And then you move over to the 10 factors of life, how life expresses itself or flows. So the 10 factors, again, are analysis that depending on what state of life we're in, it affects our appearance. It can be seen in our appearance, in our nature, in the entity of our life. It affects the power that our lives can evince. It affects, therefore, if it affects power, it affects the influence. So if you're in hell, you have very little life force, very little power, therefore very little influence. And then it goes through the chain of cause and effect. And finally, it says consistency from beginning to end. So the fact that if we're angry, that anger is expressed in all those different ways in our lives, shows the totality of our life in the state of anger. And then, if you look further over from there, that becomes evident in the 3 realms. Our anger is expressed not only within ourselves, the realm of ourselves, but also in our relationship with society, and even it affects the land on which we live, our surroundings. So that is again totality, isn't it? With absolute consistency from beginning to end, our life state affects, virtually the whole universe, but in more immediate terms, the land and the people amongst which we live. So this explanation, of course, is theoretical, it's a theory, but nevertheless it takes in both totality as well as the parts, the analysis. So Sensei concludes really by saying that if people understand the nature of life force, that is the law of life at work in everything, through cause and effect, then they can really decide how they want to live their lives and actually bring it about without being bowled over by the constant changes that are occurring all around us. So I feel this is an incredibly important thing to teach. We've already seen that some people suffer because they're obsessed by everything changing. Other people suffer because they don't want anything to change, but it does. This is the very nature of life itself. And this is why Sensei is always saying we shouldn't put too much importance to worldly possessions, to material wealth or fame. Because tomorrow morning one's fame can have disappeared, or one's wealth may have collapsed. Or equally, sometime we're going to die, and what do we do with it then? That's not what life is all about. Fulfillment and joy in life is through following goals which are concerned with the value we can create, both for ourselves and for others, in that short span of 60 or 70 years or 80 years, or however long we're destined to live, isn't it? That's really where we get joy, not out of being famous, not out of being wealthy. So this was quite a deep section of the book, but I think very, very inspiring, and perhaps makes one realize all the more, I feel, how unbelievably fortunate we are to have found this philosophy and this practice, don't you think? Thank you very much. It's time to pack up. Many thanks. Thank you. Thank you very much. you.